This show is brought to you in part by viewers like you who joined a Patreon or become YouTube members. Thank you. And if you could, hit the like button and subscribe if you want more Browns-focused content.
Okay, so this offseason, everybody spent tons of time talking about quarterbacks, right? Dylan Gabriel, Shedeur Sanders. Oh my God, Shedeur Sanders practicing at a high school gym. He looks incredible throwing at a high school field, right? We've had those conversations. Dylan Gabriel, neck up. He's great from the neck up. All this silly stuff, all this silly offseason fodder, right? Kenny Pickett texting guys as if he's a starter. Joe Flacco being treated like he's prime Peyton Manning or prime Tom Brady, going to save the Browns, win us a Super Bowl, all that silliness, right? We've had all the conversations about quarterback. Every conversation to have about quarterback, we have at least started, whether it be on my channel, somebody else's channel, it's all been done, right? We talked about the run game, especially on this channel. I'm a little bit concerned about the run game. I have some questions about what that's going to look like. But the one thing I don't think I've done a great job of focusing in on is the offensive line. And look, I think the poor quality play at quarterback was as big as a hindrance or the biggest hindrance to the Browns' success in 2024 over any other factor. No doubt about it, right? If we're looking at a blame pie for 2024, the quarterback position has over 50% of the blame, right? It has a plurality, a majority in that fault. I don't shy away from thinking that. My opinion is that the reason it is because the Browns had not just bad quarterback play in 2024, the worst quarterback play in the NFL. You can look at multiple statistics and really figure this one out for yourself. If you look at EPA per play, the Browns were awful, last in the league by a significant margin. The number I like is success rate for quarterbacks over 100 snaps. I've said it so many times on this channel. I'll say it one more time. But if you look at that number, the success rate in passing attempts for quarterbacks in the NFL, over 100 passing attempts, the Browns had 47th out the 47th in Dorian Thompson-Robinson and 46 out of 47 in Deshaun Watson, play for them the bulk of the games last year. That's a huge reason why the Browns were such a bad football team last year. So not taking quarterbacks off the hook, not taking the run game off the hook here, but the offensive line certainly was not what we wanted that offensive line to be. Now, there's a number of reasons, switching from the traditional style in which the Browns like to run the ball versus what Ken Dorsey wanted to do. There's also the change from having Bill Callahan to Andy Dickerson, which ended up being a tumultuous, horrific hire for the team. For whatever reason, Andy Dickerson was not received well by the Browns offensive line, and that partnership eroded like months into it starting in Cleveland. Again, for whatever reason it was, right? Andy Dickerson just straight up did not work out. It was even to the point of when you watch the Hard Knocks during the season, Andy Dickerson was nowhere to be found, right? I remember pointing that out. I'm like, hey, everybody's coaching the O-line room but Andy Dickerson. And that ended up being something that was more than a kernel of truth there, right? Andy Dickerson had been pretty much dismissed before he got fired. So those things kind of factored in, right? That's what the Browns offensive line says. They say they went away from doing what they were successful in years past and kind of embraced this Ken Dorsey offense, which was not what they were successful in. And that's kind of what the veterans on the team blame for the downturn and success there. I think the story's a little deeper than that, right? I think if you look at this Browns offensive line and you really, really, really break it down, there are three things that I think they're hoping make a difference this year. One, getting rid of Jedrick Wills is going to be a net positive. I think they truly believe that not having Jedrick Wills, taking him out, is going to be a net positive. Because if you look at Jed's career, 2020, he was all right. 2021, he was decent. And then after 2021, Jed Wills just nosedived into being an awful tackle. And that coincided with the Browns' run performance dipping drastically after 2021. So they're saying Jed's out. We're going to bring in Dewan as his successor. We're going to change up some stuff around the margins to make this team fit better. But Jed being out is going to be a good thing for this team and replacing him. The other factor I think they're hoping on is depth, right? Being deeper than they were last year. Jermaine Ifedi, I think, started 11 games last year for the Cleveland Browns. I think that's a big factor into why the Browns' offensive line has not looked great the last 2 years. And also, if we look at the Browns' offensive line over the last 2 years, both of these seasons, the Browns have started 4 or more tackles during the year. Right? 2023, they had to start 4 more tackles. 2024, they started 4 or more tackles. That kind of plays into why the offensive line wasn't looking great, because the Browns had so much instability at the tackle position. So having better depth, getting rid of Jedrick Wills, I think those are 2 things they're banking on to make this offensive line perform better. And they're going to return to the old. But when I say the Browns are going to return to that old run scheme that they used to run, I think there's a lot of miscommunication amongst what people think is going to happen when people say that, right? Because I don't think people truly understood what the Browns were successful at in 2021 and 2020 and how the Browns like to structure their run game. I think we just hear things like wide zone system and make certain assumptions that are pretty reasonable when you just hear those words, and go on from that. So what I want to do in today's video is really focus in on exactly what needs to change in the offensive line, what will change in the offensive line, and if there is any evidence that things changing will actually make a positive difference. Another factor to the offensive line, like having much worse pass blocking performance, I thought was quarterback play. Again, the Browns had the worst quarterback play in the NFL through various advanced metrics. They were the worst quarterback team by a significant margin in the NFL. And I think this tends to skew how people look at the Browns offensive line, because Deshaun Watson specifically is really good at doing things that make you believe his offensive lines are worse than they actually are, right? This is a thing. People talk about this being potentially a thing with Shedeur Sanders. We'll see if that factors in when we see Shedeur play in training camp and in the preseason. But with Deshaun Watson, this is 1,000% a thing, right? We saw this with Deshaun in Houston. We saw it with Deshaun in Cleveland. Offensive lines tend to look worse and have worse numbers when Deshaun is the quarterback. Why? Because Deshaun has habits that are horrific for helping your tackles, right? I've talked about it over the last 3 years ad nauseum. Even when I thought Deshaun wasn't playing the worst in the world, I had this as a consistent complaint. Deshaun Watson would consistently drop too far in his dropbacks, creating horrific angles for his tackles. Deshaun Watson holds on to the ball much longer than he really has to, which leads to extra opportunity for pass rushers. Deshaun played a style of football that was going to make your offensive line look worse, regardless of how good that offensive line was. We saw this in Houston. People thought that Houston offensive line was trash. Deshaun Watson leaves it. They eventually, a year or two later, get C.J. Stroud behind that same offensive line, and we're not complaining about how trash the offensive line is anymore, right? You do the simple math there. What changed? It was Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson comes to Cleveland in the 2022 offseason, right? After the Browns in 2021 and 2020 had some of the best offensive lines in football. Then over the next 2 years with Deshaun Watson back there, that offensive line's reputation has been degraded to the point where people don't even think they're good anymore. What's the common denominator? It's Deshaun Watson. So if we look at this team's pass blocking performance and we kind of factor in when they had Deshaun Watson out there versus when they don't, the pass block grades on PFF get significantly better, right? If we're just looking at the performance that they had from weeks 1 to 7 to the rest of the year, or at least when Jameis was out there, the Browns' offensive line pass blocking grade went from 52.5 with Deshaun out there to 58.7 when Jameis is out there. Now, if Pro Football Focus grades aren't your cup of tea and you like something more concrete, the Browns during that weeks 1 through 7 when Deshaun was out there gave up 16 pressures per game, gave up 3 quarterback hits per game. Those numbers reduced to 12 and 2 when Jameis Winston was out there. Also, another thing to consider is that Jameis Winston did not enjoy having a healthy offensive line as much as Deshaun did. See, Deshaun dealt with some injuries for the first couple of weeks on the offensive line, but pretty much till the end of his run, he had a healthy offensive line. Those are the numbers they're putting up. Jameis Winston almost exclusively played with backup tackles at the left tackle position, whether it be DeJuan Jones, who was out of weight for most of the season or overweight for most of the season, or Jermaine Ifedi, who played the bulk of Jameis's time there. So the number went up despite the fact that the Browns tackles got injured during that time period to a significant degree. So that is significant to me. If we look at the 3 weeks where Deshaun Watson wasn't the quarterback, and the Browns didn't have a significant injury at the tackle position, right? There were 3 weeks, weeks 8, 9, and 11, where the Browns had that going on. The Browns' pass blocking grades were up all the way to 67.1. Again, they were at 52.5 with Deshaun out there. If they're healthy with Jameis out there, it goes all the way up to 67.1. That's 11 pressures given up a game. Again, with Deshaun out there, 16. 1 quarterback hit given up per game, which with Deshaun, it was 3. So who plays quarterback is going to have an impact on how this offensive line looks from a pass blocking perspective. I think just getting Deshaun Watson up out of there, not playing him, is going to make a significant difference to how this pass block unit looks, on top of the Browns playing a more protective style. If not Jameis, but if Joe Flacco or Kenny Pickett are the starting quarterbacks for the majority of the season, I think the pass blocking will be pretty solid. I don't know if the pass games will be solid, but the pass blocking will be solid. So I'm not overly concerned with how this team is going to look from a pass blocking perspective. I think a lot of the horrific numbers that they've put up over the last couple of years point directly to Deshaun Watson being a significant factor in why the pass blocking has not been what we wanted to. There's ample evidence of it. If you want to ignore it at this point, you're just denying reality. Deshaun Watson had a significant factor in the pass block performance of the Cleveland Browns, and the quarterback position in general will have a significant factor in that. And look, if it's Joe Flacco, if it's Kenny Pickett, I believe that they'll probably be fine from a pass blocking perspective. If you put one of the rookies in, it starts to get questionable because who knows how a rookie's going to look in that situation. Now, one thing that did not change was the run blocking performance. And throughout any split, right? Deshaun in, just Jameis, the special period of time where it was Jameis and a healthy offensive line, the run blocking performance was pretty poor all season. So I wanted to take a look at that, right? When they talk about changing the offensive line back to what they used to do, they're not talking about pass blocking. They're talking about run blocking. So what does that look like, right? So now this brings me to the run game. Now, the first thing to understand about the Browns run game, the Browns offensive line as it relates to that run game, and what this is going to look like going forward is you have to understand gap run schemes versus zone run schemes. Gap run schemes, and this is a simplification of it, right? You can go on YouTube. I think Chalk Talk Football does a pretty good job of really drawing up these schemes to make it very understandable. So you can go ahead and check out Chalk Talk Football. You'll have a more in-depth explanation of this. Obviously, it gets deeper than that, but here's a basic explanation of gap run scheme versus zone. A gap run scheme is one where you're concentrating a lot of your offensive line towards a singular gap, right? It's less about the running back making decisions and more about brute force, right? This is where you'll see the Browns run a lot of counter, right? Where they pull Wyatt, they pull David Njoku, and the running back just follows the hip of David Njoku to pay dirt. That is kind of the gap scheme system, right? It's less about vision. It's less about being able to choose which gap you're going to go into. And it's more about just throwing a lot of resources at a specific gap to open that gap up. It's more of a designed run philosophy. Zone run plays are plays where there are multiple options based on specific reads the running back makes on what that running back can do. Now, this varies per different run concept, right? Inside zone, not a ton of choices to make, right? You're either going to read the open gap or you're going to do a cutback. But then there are more complicated kind of zone run concepts and so on and so forth. And I think when people hear that the Browns are this wide zone based system, they assume that the Browns have always run a large percentage of zone runs. That's not the case. In 2020, the Browns split between zone and gap schemes about 45-45, which is just dead even. So half of their runs were zone, half of their runs were gap. The missing percentage is either scrambles or broken plays, right? 2021, the Browns had a 35 zone to 54 gap scheme split. Now, this is important, right? Because when people talk about let's go back to 2021, they're talking about a scheme that is different than 2020. I think we just assume, since it's Kevin, it's the same exact stuff. But the 2021 run game was a lot different than the 2021, where the Browns ran zone about 35% of the time. They ran gap about 54% of the time. So all of a sudden, the zone goes down, the gap scheme goes up, and that's really what the Browns were focusing on. So if you're thinking about gap run plays, power is a great example of a gap scheme run play. Counter is also another example of a gap scheme run play. The Browns pulling guys into specific gaps to funnel them through brute force. That's kind of what was their bread and butter in 2021. It's also worth noting, even though the 2021 Browns team did underperform, the 2021 Browns run game is probably the best it's ever looked under Kevin Stefanski. So when they say going back to 2021, right, when you hear Joe Bitonio not saying let's go back to 2020, let's go back to 2021, this is the split he's talking about, right? More gap than zone. Now, 2022, it was about a 35-50 split. 2023, it was again another 35-54 split. So pretty much since 2021, they've been a primarily gap scheme team versus a zone running team. And I think people misunderstand that, right? Because we just kind of widely, because there's a lot of play action, categorize the Cleveland Browns as a wide zone team, but they run a lot of gap schemes. So in their run game, 2024 is where this dynamic flips, where the Browns are running 53% of their runs in zone and 37% of their runs in gap. Now, if we break this down into chunks of the season where Kevin was calling the plays versus Ken Dorsey, the same flip remains. It's just more drastic with Ken Dorsey, right? Kevin Stefanski called zone run plays about 47% of the time, and in gap run plays about 39% of the time. So still more zone than gap. And then Ken Dorsey went from 47 to 57 and from 39 gap scheme to 34. So he abandoned it even further. So when the Browns say they're going back to doing what they've done, they're not talking about running a lot of zone. They ran a lot of zone last year. What they're talking about is running more gap scheme plays. And you can tell this by the running backs that they've added to the team or decided to keep, right? Jerome Ford is not a zone runner. He does not have the vision or the processing to be a zone runner. He's always been slow at that. But gap is more Jerome Ford's bread and butter, right? If you open up a hole for Jerome Ford to run through, he's going to break through and make a lot of things happen here, right? Quincy Junkins, the big knock on him is that he doesn't have great vision. But in a gap scheme, you don't have to have great vision, right? Dylan Sampson, then again, another guy whose knock on him was he doesn't have great vision, not great eyes in zone. But that's not what they're asking him to do. Tommy Reese at Alabama ran more gap run slightly than zone. I think what we're going to see is not the same like 50-30 split that they operated on since 2020, but I think it's going to be probably 45-40, right? Or, somewhere along those lines of percentages. You got to factor in like the broken plays and the scrambles. They're not going to be gap or zone run plays. That's why the percentages don't equally add up to 100% all the time. But yeah, I think it's going to be a slight edge to gap scheme right now with the Cleveland Browns. And that's kind of what they're going to focus on, right? They're going to use David Njoku on counter a lot. They're going to have him be a wrap player on those plays and kind of get out in space because they want DeJuan to down block because he can't get in space well. Like, I think this is the plan for the Browns offense, or at least the Browns offensive line, and why they don't really seem as concerned about running back personnel as I am, right? Because if I'm making the assumption that we're going to run a lot of zone, then like who's running the ball matters a lot, right? Like that's what Nick Chubb excelled at, the cutback lanes, making great decisions on zone blocking schemes. And there's a lot of advantages to doing both styles. But if they're like, hey, we're just going to brute force this, get our guys in space, let them do what they do well, they still can do it, we can do this at a high level, then yeah, they do feel good about giving Jerome Ford more than 100 carries. They do feel fine about throwing Dylan Sampson out there. So that, to me, kind of points to where the Browns are focusing on the offensive line. And it points to what their philosophy is to how they're going to get better. They're going to emphasize more gap scheme plays. They're going to add young gap scheme focused running backs to this room. And they're going to get their offensive line back to doing what they did well, which was moving in space. A lot of counter concepts, right? A lot of power, like just moving them, getting these guards on the go. They have a tight end who can go out and rap for you, right? So, and also with Harold Fainin Jr., it gives you flexibility if he can rap block, because then you can be less predictable if you want to run some of these counter concepts out of 12 personnel, because then it's not obvious to which side the ball is being ran. Because that's one of the things with gap schemes, right? You're a little bit more predictable when you're running a ton of gap, because you run these schemes that have obvious tells, right? If you're going to run counter and they know you're going to run counter, then the tight end is going to be on the opposite side of where the ball is going, right? So it's more easy to protect yourself. Again, you're trying to win a battle of brute force if you're the Cleveland Browns. So there are pros and cons to gap versus zone. The Browns are clearly, in my opinion, going back towards gap schemes because that's what's worked for them, and it gives them a lower floor at the running back position. This is how they think they're going to win, right? This is their bread and butter. This is what they're going to go back to. It's going to be the basis of everything they do. If they're successful running the ball out these gap schemes, that's going to open up the play action pass. That's going to open up the offense a great bit. If they're not successful, then this thing's going to start to look pretty ugly pretty fast. So that's the bet that they're making. And I can understand why they're confident in that bet, because Joe Bitonio's great at that kind of stuff. Wyatt Teller's great at that kind of stuff. That's what Ethan Pocic does best. And since you have David Njoku, you're not reliant on your tackle to be a rap player. And if you can do all of that, then yeah, you will have a pretty solid run game, regardless of who's running the ball. So I see the philosophy, and I think that's kind of one of the larger philosophies on why the Browns feel like they're going to be much better in the run game. So it's about a change to going back to being more gap scheme focused. It's about having more depth, right? You got Cornelius Lucas you can bring off the bench. You got Tevin Jenkins you can bring off the bench. Both these guys, really good run blockers. So you have that depth. And then you're replacing Jed Wills with DeJuan Jones, which you hope is going to be a complete upgrade. And I think that's kind of the basis of what the Browns' plan is to improve the offensive line. I do not think this is a bad plan. I think this qualifies as a plan and as a plan that could be successful. You're betting on your guards at advanced age, well, at least Joe Bitonio at a bit of an advanced age, getting up and moving a lot. But if Joel feels like he can still do that at a high level, then you got to trust him because he's one of the best Browns to ever do that, right? So this puts Wyatt in a position to do more of what he does well. And I think if you're worried about the pass blocking, having quarterbacks who know how to navigate a pocket better will be useful for the Cleveland Browns. And even somebody like Shedeur, who does get flack for not doing a good job at navigating the pocket at the college level, I will point out that Shedeur did improve from his first year at Colorado to his second year of Colorado at managing that kind of stuff. I thought he was significantly better. And second, I would say that Shedeur has all the tools to be able to figure that out because his game is not reliant on athleticism in the same way that Deshaun's was, where Deshaun's instincts to roll out were always going to be rewarded to a certain point, which is why he always did it, right? Shedeur is going to have to make that adjustment. He's not going to be able to roll out in the NFL a ton. He's going to have to learn to step up in order to be successful. So if he is somebody who can start for the team, I'm going to assume that's something he acquired along the way to get to that place and part of why he would be ready to go out there. So I don't anticipate him being that big of a disaster when it comes to getting sacked in the NFL if he sees the field, because it's just one of those things that has to be critical in your evaluation of if he can see the field. I could be wrong there. They could surprise me. I wouldn't be too surprised if the Browns surprised me, unfortunately. But that's kind of what I think the plan is. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Do you think this is a good plan for the Browns to fix their offensive line? Do you like the change from gap scheme, well, from zone scheme to gap scheme, going kind of back to what they did successfully in years past? Are you a bit concerned about it? Let me know in the comment section down below. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.